Hello, today is Tuesday, July 30th, 2019. This is the SIG Arch Conformance Office Hours. I will share my screen and we can walk through some of the agenda topics that are currently there. Hopefully folks can see my screen.
Yes.
Great. So Claudio wanted to go first because he has limited time, so why don't you kick us off here?
Yeah, thank you so much for allowing me. Recently, the version of Redis that is being used in our tests and also conformance tests has been bumped to 5.0 or something like that, mostly because it has IPv6 support, which is perfectly fine. The only issue is that the Windows port of Redis only goes up to 3.2, which is a bit lower than 5. And we are already encountering some issues because of that in some tests. So there are not so many tests which use that image, but there are a couple of conformance ones which do. Some of them, from what I saw, doesn't necessarily have to be Redis. One of them, kind of. Speaking of the guestbook application test, if you do know. I will link the issues later after I'm done talking. So what we were talking in SIG Windows about this, we were thinking about either limiting the usage of the Redis image to a minimum, or for example, in some cases, like the guest application test, to add a Windows alternative, which would use something else, which we'll have to propose later. So the first question is, would you allow something like this in the first hand?
I think it depends upon the test. I'd have to see. I think that would probably be the general answer for all of these. Or it's possible that we could deploy if then else with the version for target platform too. I know we're trying to dedupe the images where possible. The ideal scenario would be to like potentially dedupe this with a single binary. I don't know if you can put a mixed mode artifact thing in place here. It might be more complication than what it's worth. But for simplicity for something like this, it might be easier just to say if platform X deploy this version, otherwise platform Y deploy this version, and then document it inside the tests.
I'm not sure I'm okay with that. I feel like I'd rather have a test that's, if there's something that needs to be Windows specific, it should be a Windows specific test. And we should work to make sure that the conformance tests use some sort of image that works in an operating system agnostic way. And then, as you said, Tim, I think it becomes a question that I would delegate to the SIGs who own the tests that are leaning on Redis, right? So like if the guestbook app is involved in a conformance test, that is probably a SIG apps question where they are like, this is a workload that is representative of something that is expected to work across all Kubernetes clusters. And we would need them to clarify whether their stance is like the latest version of Redis should work everywhere or this specific version of Redis should work everywhere.
Yeah, it's totally dependent upon the test.
Because I get really squirrely when it's like it is conditional which image we used depending on which image we used depending on which operating system we use, because then I feel like the same code isn't necessarily being exercised.
Well, I don't think that's true at all. I think that's a false choice because you're basically testing Kubernetes behavior on the output artifact of an image. It's just that the image is not supported within a given platform. So I'm not terribly concerned on that, so long as it's only on the behavior. So long as the behavior that we're checking in Kubernetes is consistent, the target image for guestbooks should be pretty much irrelevant because we're only dependent upon like we should not be depending upon the target images for something like a guestbook application. I hope not.
The reason I get squirrely about it is because I think it increases the review burden and requires a lot more manual interpretation. So this is a totally made up scenario and might not be realistic, but let's say there's something that needs to verify that host networking functions appropriately. And so it schedules an image, and then we change that to like become something that schedules an image depending upon the operating system. And the image itself doesn't actually exercise host networking. Like the Windows specific image doesn't exercise it. And then it looks like it's a conformance test that's exercising a behavior, but unless we really dig down through the specific code in each of the two different images, we don't actually know what's happening. So that's why
it's based entirely on the test. Like I go back to that original statement. Like I don't think we can make general suppositions.
For example, if we can replace the image used without actually affecting the test or what it is or what the outcome is, it should be okay, right? For example, the Redis image is used in a couple of kubectl tests, which basically just verifies the output for pods and RCs and stuff like that, which from what I saw at the first glance has nothing to do with the fact that it is the Redis image.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, which is fine. Like I'd rather we keep the conversation towards like what operating system agnostic image can we use that meets all the needs rather than splitting up. That's all.
Well, what he's saying is that like there are some things we can't make that statement either. Like so, it's got to be in a test by test basis because there's some, I know the IPv6 work is a pain in the rear, but it needs to move forwards because people are enabling it. So we should minimize the dependencies on image specific data that's outside of our control where possible. That's the only generic statement we should make, and we should deal with it on a test by test basis. I don't think this will be fruitful, Claudio, unless you actually give us specific issues and links to them. The kube control one, I think, is a non-issue.
For example, I'm gonna paste in the doc right now one link which has been opened regarding this, which I have at hand. And
this one in particular is only fetching the logs, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you could use any image. So the answer is don't.
Yeah. Adelina already proposed a fix for this, which uses agnost log generator subcommand instead.
Sure.
For example.
Yeah, and that sounds great.
This test, that makes sense, right? But if there's something that we're actually relying on the function of the image, then that's a different story.
Mm-hmm. And that's just why I drilled straight to the SIGApp, to guestbook and SIGApps, because maybe that's seen as a representative workload that we want to work everywhere. Maybe we need to revisit that decision and say, actually, it's got to be a different application.
Yeah. So why don't we keep this focused on the actual issues at hand? And this one here, you already have a beat on it, and I think everyone agrees that that's the right approach. Mm-hmm. Do you have another issue, Claudio, that you wanted to reference here?
At this moment, no. But what I can do would be list all open an issue and list all the tests which use the Redis image, and if they actually have to be the Redis image.
Yep.
And if not, we could replace them with something else, which is more platform agnostic.
Yeah. Yep. But we do have an issue open for guestbook, though, and that's the one I just pasted in the chat. But I guess on that one, you're saying, you mentioned take it to SIGApps, but it's marked as SIG CLI, and the test title is Kube Control Client, guestbook application should create and stop a working application. And so for that one, I believe that if we simplify something so that's still deploying an application that is OS agnostic, then that would be a reasonable change for this one as well.
Yes, it would be. Yeah. Yeah, I just want to make sure we don't go in the rabbit hole on this one about making general statements about things. Look at what the test is testing, and if it's relying upon a very specific version that is not platform agnostic, we should remove that dependency where possible to use the agnostic images. And I think that's the most general statement I can make that I feel comfortable with. And I think is that jive with you, Aaron, as well?
Yes, that's what I was saying. We should always drive to that. I don't even want to talk about splitting up until we find we have to do that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right. Of course.
Then I'll follow up with a new issue and CC the conformance area.
Sounds good.
This discussion.
And that also helps us with the effort of making it to where all the images are a list that could be run offline, because the guest book stuff is pulling from random GCR repos too. So,
yep, that'd be good too. All right. Any other questions, comments, complaints, concerns there? Or is that horse sufficiently beaten to death?
Regarding this, no.
Okay. Next up, Clayton, the wonderful metrics API conformance requirement.
Yeah, do we want to take this to the end? Because I think this will take a little bit longer than some of the others. I'm okay moving it to the end.
Sure. All right. Image centralization, John.
So I got behind just because of some vacation time and catching up, but I found my old notes and tried to review what images were being used by conformance, and then looked at the PRs that Claudia did to aggregate those images. And it still seems like there's a handful of images that we would need rather, the ideal situation is there only one. I think right now we're down to a handful, but there's some conflicts in my notes about what that exact list is. Also, that's kind of due to lack of ability to really clearly check which images are used. The best case I did to try and discover which were used during conformance run was to build some custom debug lines into it, and just every time you asked for, get this image name, to dump that out. And that's what I looked at. But the problem with that is there's some common code that just pulls a bunch of images, whether or not they're used. It just pulls them ahead of time. So, I'll do my best to try to manually investigate, but, I'm not really sure how much more centralization. I think it's been talked about there's at least 2 or 3 more maybe that we could do. And maybe that's where we set the milestone at least and say, once, like the test web server, the Nautilus, the kitten images, maybe one more than that, then we're maybe down to a fairly minimal set. That's my opinion right now.
If you have any other image suggestions, I'm open to continue the centralization effort.
Okay. Yeah, the only one I know that's, I think, pretty simple, and I think you had mentioned this one too, was the kitten and the Nautilus, which are really just simple web servers that return an image based on the path you hit or something like that, or they only support one path. So I think those should be simple. The other ones start getting more complicated, like some of those guest book apps, some other, Redis, we're not going to do that. Some of these I'm not really familiar with, and so I think they're a little more complicated or focused in their use, which is why I'm skeptical they're really used in the conformance test. I want to do the manual checks for those.
Mm-hmm. For the kitten and the Nautilus, we'll have to incorporate the test web server image first, because those depend on that one. And I was also thinking about resource consumer and resource consumer controller images.
Yeah, I have those on my list to look into. I wasn't sure if those were actually used in conformance tests. Do you know whether or not they are really?
I'm not sure, but I think they were proposed, some tests that were using those images were proposed for conformance. They're mostly related to auto-scaling. So if if auto-scaling tests are included in conformance, then we would have an answer.
Okay.
The other one, I'm also not sure whether it's used in conformance or not. I noticed we have both BusyBox and Alpine. It would be cool to choose just one. And
Well, to be fair, BusyBox is commonly used in the Windows images, at least as a base. And in the Kubernetes Windows test images pull requests that I have, also adds the BusyBox Windows image.
And I actually don't have Alpine in my list of conformance images, so I'm not certain that a conformance test uses Alpine.
I was scraping through all images, so I wasn't refining down to conformance. I would want to
I think
double check that work.
I think there's a test that pulls image from Docker Hub. Is the one that uses Alpine.
Yeah, possible. Okay.
Yeah, so I think we're close, maybe two more PRs, and then I'd say we kind of did what we could do there. But I do want to have a more exact list there.
Mm-hmm. There's still a few changes that were proposed for the diagnosed image, for example, including the DNS tools for the Linux image, which would also reduce the DNS utils image, almost, excluding the DNS mask part. So I'm not sure about that yet, if we could also centralize the DNS mask part, or core DNS instead.
Yeah, if we use core DNS instead, that runs on Windows, so you can...
Yeah. So basically, if we include the DNS tools and core DNS in the diagnosed image, we could also reduce the DNS utils image, because it was already proposed in an issue. I don't have it right here, but I was.
I recall looking at some of those tests and wondering whether, like, whether we really need to have the complication of adding in the a DNS server and actually run a DNS server as part of those tests. But I guess that's...
There are still a couple of non-conformance tests which does that. It's basically related to config maps and DNS servers, but I haven't looked too much into detail regarding that. Yeah. I'll have to do it at one point.
And when you're talking about the DNS utils, this is the image that's specifically called Jesse DNS utils, is that right?
There's the DNS utils and the Jesse DNS utils images. The Jesse DNS utils is related based on the CentOS Jesse image, and there are some reasons that image is used. I don't remember the reasons in particular, because when I heard it was something like 6 months ago, so I don't remember that. And I couldn't dig through my emails.
Yeah, I never got an answer on that.
Although the Jesse version has been archived in the CentOS archives, so I'm not sure how much longer we'll have to support that.
One more year. That's why I was wondering if it was something about it being an old LTS version, in which case we might want to consider moving to a newer one. And I don't know if we ever got somebody from like networking to answer that question for us or not.
Mm-hmm. And another thing that I'll have to add, a version sub function, because apparently someone hit an issue and a version would have helped tremendously. I saw the comments on one of the promotion pull requests.
So what was the thing with the version? You want a version what?
For example, to add a version subcommand to agnost binary.
Oh, we had an issue where one of the local, when somebody was doing local testing, their local image seemed to be different from the image that was actually in GCR. And just for debugging purposes, it made it a little bit confusing. So when they'd go and actually submit the PR and it'd go through, go through the CI fail. And so it would have been nice to have a version thing, but I mean,
okay.
Yeah, I can work on that. I can add it.
So just to follow up from the main root of this issue, the main issue that we had for deduping you said was closed, John. Should we reopen it and make it more of an umbrella issue? How do you want to track the progress of this as well as other things that get uncovered along the way?
Yeah, I will reopen it. I will, when I reopen it, identify the exact images that we need to dedupe in order for this issue to be considered closed. Again, it's one of those things like we could always keep moving the goalpost, and I don't want to do that. So I will make a list of things that seem reasonable to do now, and then we can reevaluate if we want to open another ticket after that. And I think if I'm only going to be adding 3 or 4 images, 5 images there, I'm hoping that we can get all those in for the 1.16 release. Does that sound reasonable, Claudia?
Yep, perfectly.
All right. Does this topic seem sufficiently conversed about? All right. I'm debating whether or not the order of how to address these ones that are listed below and who wrote this portion down here. I think I'm going to jump around a little bit because it seems like I want to put Clayton's. I'm going to put this one up above because I think we can actually hammer this one out pretty fast. I actually want to leave the behavioral end-to-end testing for last because that's probably going to be the longest one, and then put Clayton's here. So I don't know exactly who wrote this one. There's 2 issues that affect our coverage of endpoints. Who wrote that there?
This is Hippie. I wrote that.
Okay. Could you want to describe the problem currently?
Sure. Over the past month or so, I can get the specific dates, but we had some tests added, which increased the goalpost. We had somewhere around 800 and some odd tests, or 800 endpoints, and we added 16 more. And since we didn't add more endpoint coverage with conformance, that meant that we lost percentages. So we dropped down to like 14-something% coverage. And I was really wanting to understand how we were able to merge these particular ones in. And I did a little bit of conversation on the conformance channel, and it looks like one of the endpoints is optional. But I wouldn't have known that without just having conversation on, well, why is it optional? It's in core. So I would love to know how we can keep the goalpost the same when we're adding optional tests. Have some metadata or something we can say this is not, can never be part of conformance, even though it's in core. And the other one was the stable admission registration advanced from beta to V1, and it looks like it's scheduled for release in 16. And I want to know what the protocol is. We have some definitions in a KEP that says it needs to have tests, but we don't have any automation in place to do that. And so I wanted to look at what we want policy-wise, and then also maybe some things for automation so that we can catch these before they merge next time, if we want to stop them, so we can have conversations about them.
So the first one is hard. I don't know if I have a good answer for you other than to walk the actual types data and make sure that there's enough meta and documentation to describe the fields, which I'm guessing there probably is, or there might not be. I'd have to take a look at this one in particular. Do you know off the top of your head if this was documented inside the types field? So if you go underneath the API reference, do you see it listed as optional?
It's not it's the type itself being the service account token. The type. It doesn't appear to be. It is required in a few. So you've got the API operation parameters, and then you've got the API object properties. And I didn't look specifically on where the difference between what's required as a property and what's required as a parameter. But I don't think that's related to it being optional in Kubernetes. It sounds like it's different.
I think that this is actually exactly related to Clayton's issue, right? There are certain APIs that whether the API is even essentially installed or not, like with the metrics, it's an aggregated API server. So like that's an optional decision. That's not going to appear anywhere in our API schema, because if it's not there, it doesn't even appear in the API schema, right? So there's not even
I think what I'm looking for is in the parameters to API server, when you have enable particular features, I need to know which of the what endpoints or what operations and what objects that feature enables or disables, so we can tie them together. Because if it's not going to be there, but it's still in core, it's confusing.
So what about this makes it optional? Like, other than like you can specify a true or false, like I think the testing of the behavior, what am I missing here that says this is totally optional?
So what the reason it's optional is it's not enabled by default in the API server. So while it may exist in the API swagger.json and in our generated documentation, a particular instance of API server will not have it enabled because the option is not enabled by default. That's the feature, like the actual feature flag on API server, the binary.
So we were talking about feature flag detection for test. Well, this gets weird. It's not exactly the same, John, as the profile style workload versus feature gated behavior. We really need to do a better job of sort of defining the layers, and we've not done that because we've been too busy like triaging.
Mm-hmm.
But I really do think we need a document that describes the layers.
Feature gate's an interesting one because if it's feature gated, it should either be on or off. It shouldn't be off once it hits GA unless there's like extenuating circumstance. Nothing should be like the configuration for gates enablement. Is this one actually something besides a feature gate? This is an actual flag?
It's a field and a feature gate is what he's saying.
Okay, because yeah, like feature gates, I would be like once they reach GA, or like then they are fair game, and the gate should always be on. If you turn off a feature, maybe this is like there's like actually two separate things here. Now that I think about it, there's the profile aspect and the config variation, but there's another one which is: are you allowed to turn off a feature gate once it has hit GA and still be considered conformant?
I would probably say no, right?
It feels like it, but yeah.
Not to go off on a total tangent, but this gets into another topic I want to bring up on Thursday, which is a production readiness review. And any feature we add, ideally any feature we add should be able to be turned off. Even, I guess we have to decide what GA means, but like if you deploy a cluster and you have some feature on and you see an error or a problem that's causing errors, you would want to be able to turn it off. Maybe once we get to GA, that's not necessary anymore, and we just, I think that's debatable, I guess, is my point.
So I think the problem here is there's a lot of organic growth before extension mechanisms came into play. Mm-hmm. And anything that's optional should be an extension, right? Like CNI, CRI, CSI are well-defined extension points, right? And you're able to swap out individual provider-specific details there. And anything that is a feature that has fields in the main API that is an optional parameter to the API server, that strikes me as fundamentally wrong. And we should probably go back and review this, but I would ask to open an issue here, Hippie, that we can take back to SIGArch. I think we should discuss this in SIGArch because I think it's beyond the scope of this group.
Cool. I will open that for SIGArch for the feature gate. The second issue related to coverage of endpoints, which actually had a greater impact on the numbers, was stable admission registration. I think it's pretty normal. It's not optional. There are no tests, and it's in V1.
So I looked just real quick while you were chatting earlier, and there are tests. They just all have the name admission webhook. They're not conformance tests. So we don't have any mechanism in play. Like I think we have hopes and dreams that we say that if your feature goes GA, it has to have conformance tests. And then I don't think that humans do a really good job of enforcing those hopes and dreams, and we definitely don't have bots enforcing that. We do have one of our policies saying like it can't be a conformance test unless the things that it's exercising are stable. So in some sense, it's hit the correct next step. All of the resources are now stable V1. They're not beta, they're not alpha. So that criteria has check marked. So now it's like, well, can we promote these tests? Are they written well? Can they be conformance tests? What I don't know is like what mechanism would we have to say, you don't have conformance tests, your feature cannot go out the door.
So that actually is in the CAP as a GA graduation criteria that they should have that. But like you said, there's nothing enforcing it other than people reviewing the GA graduation, and there's maybe too many criteria to follow, and likely, well, I don't know. So really, the CAP that included the graduated those to GA should have included a requirement for conformance tests.
So why don't we do this, open an issue regarding this, and tag, I don't know we don't really have a formalized carrot and stick policy here, right? Maybe, is it meant for 116 hippie?
Yeah. Dan pointed out something kind of funny to me. If the percentage of coverage is on its way down, at what point and how long will it take for us to reach near 0% coverage? Our goal is to get to 100% coverage, so I'm trying to find a way to keep the hole from getting deeper as I'm putting the dirt in.
So then for this particular one, we should hold the authors of the CAP accountable and try to push them in the right direction where possible. So opening an issue, assign it as some type of blocker, and you can assign me, and I'll put all the right flags on it and loop in the release team there. I don't think we have formal policy of how we enforce this, so maybe we talk about this too as well at the higher level. I don't know if Arch can even enforce this because it's like a release mechanization thing, right? Who's going to be the gatekeeper to ensure that we GA'd a feature and all the I's are dotted and all the T's are crossed?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was referring to with the production readiness, because I've got a bunch more I's and T's that I want to add to that, and that there's no process right now for making sure those things.
It's the tech debt we've accumulated. Ideally, that CAP describes a checklist. In an ideal world, that checklist is completely machine enforceable. In the world where it's not, we've had subject matter experts agree that that checklist contains the right items, and it's the responsibility of the release team to make sure that those checkboxes have been checked off. And if they're not, they should be able to.
Like we have an API review process, right, where there's a select set of people that are responsible for making sure APIs conform to our standards. And if we want to slow things down and have the things that go into GA be very mature, then we probably need a similar process.
Well, a part of this, there's a part of me that like, yes, we need more process, and then a part of me that bristles that
I agree.
no, we don't need more process. So I think we just need to hold the people accountable. Like, because right now in SIG cluster lifecycle, we hold each other accountable. Like if we are going to promote something to GA, we are damn sure that we dot all the I's and cross all the T's. And if we make a mistake, we do a mea culpa.
So right? I do also just want to point out that we're like a third of the way through the release cycle. Like I view this as in flight and the process is being followed. And I have good faith that they just haven't done it yet. They haven't promoted the test to conformance yet.
Okay.
There's plenty of time for that to happen.
Let's just open the issue and then CC them and just flag the right people to make sure that it gets done.
My question is just mechanically to that carrot stick question. Like if the release team decides, no, this hasn't been done and we're at the nth hour, what is the mechanism by which this cannot go out, that we can prevent, they could prevent this from going out the door, right? Is it defaulting a feature flag to false? Is it reverting the PR that enables the endpoints entirely? Like that's where I'm less clear what the enforcement mechanism is. That's all.
It depends upon the feature probably, because by definition of its GA, the feature flags are typically gone, except for the one that hippie marked above. So I would say like the standard revert policy seems appropriate. which is what, the same thing that the scalability group holds as their enforcement, right?
It is.
Again,
It's the sort of thing where like we let they've done a PR to move things to stable early in the release cycle. The decision is made late in the release cycle that it can't go out the door. How many PRs are they going to have to gather up and roll back? Like that sounds tangled and gnarly.
It is. It can be. But doing reverts is actually easier than I think some of the other stuff. So in the meantime, I think what we do is we raise the issue. I think it's also out of our purview for enforcement. So I think we should raise the issue, pass it back to SIG-Arch and SIG-Release, and say, hey, we're noticing a pattern. But there's two separate issues we need to address with the larger group. So I guess this next SIG-Arch is going to be a pretty fun meeting.
I don't even know if it's a pattern. Like, are there other features that have promoted to stable that don't have conformance tests? I feel like this is our first occurrence of running into it, and this is working as expected. We're just noticing it, and we will see this play out.
Too bad we don't have a
Dan Kahn. I just wanted to interject with 2 points, but I'm perfectly fine to move this to SIG architecture. I've been struggling to find the exact link, but it seems like everybody is agreed that there is a requirement for graduation that things need to have a conformance test with them. But Hippie was going to propose an idea of a new Prowl plugin that was going to look for essentially reductions in coverage that could then be a blocker for graduation for GA, and ideally would be pushing people with PRs to write conformance tests much earlier in the process.
I don't know if you can fully automate this problem away, Dan. Just being honest.
No, it may be too optimistic, but at least in principle, I mean, he did actually find the problem through automation, I'll point out.
Yeah.
It's just a quick statement, Tim, for how that would work. Is we're actually just going to see, does this particular endpoint or object have conformance tests, and that's the database that API Snoop consumes. So if we have particular changes to things getting particularly promoted to swagger.json, just notifying on those and say, hey, we noticed they're not tested. Even in the alpha form, we can say, here's where you're lacking coverage. What would be somewhat useful possible. I just wanted to throw that out there.
As a blocking job or as a job, I think that would be useful signal.
Yep.
All right. So the action item here is we have two action items to follow up on with SIG-Arch, and we should have issues for both of them. Is that correct?
I'll put issues after the call.
Okay. Ooh, this is a fun call today. We're only 40 minutes in. Clayton, we got more funsies coming, right?
Yeah, so we merged a conformance test that covers a V1 API that has been V1 for a very, very long time, and then we realized it depends on an optional feature, the metric server. So autoscaling, autoscaling is a V1 part of the Cube API. If you have a metric server installed, the V1 auto HPA feature is considered effectively supposed to behave the same everywhere. Autoscaling is actually a pretty, horizontal pod autoscaling is actually a pretty common end user feature, even if the implementations might differ. And this is actually a case that we have, which is we have the default metric server implementation, which exposes an API that the HPA controller reads that uses CAdvisor. There are alternative implementations in production in the wild. I know of at least the one for Prometheus, but there is one for Influx, I believe, as well, that provide rough equivalents, and there may be others. So we are in the unique case that we have a GA external important user-facing feature that depends on an optional component. Not all distributions, conformant distributions ship that. So we brainstormed a couple of options that are worth just bringing up here, even if we don't have to settle or have the full discussion. One of which is anything that depends on an optional feature will not be part of conformance. which is kind of weird because I think we talked about we brought up CSI before. The implementation of CSI is not required for the cluster. There is a description of how things should work when they are under CSI, but we don't care about the implementation. The second one is this is something like a profile, and this is like another example. We talked about security profiles for multi-tenancy, but this might be a novel one, which is is this a optional features profile or a metrics features profile? And then there may be a third option, which may or may not make sense, which is if HPA, if the metrics API is there, the HPA controller should work. So if you are a conformant distribution that did this prerequisite, then this API is expected to behave a certain way. And you can verify conformance. That would be somewhat analogous to the thing that we just kicked out, which we got rid of all of our skip optional conformance tests that skip. But there's a reasonable statement that, and this starts to get into the stuff Tim was bringing up on the previous one, of if you must do configuration in order for this to work, you can still verify that it works, but you can't verify it all the time. So do we say that every feature that may or may not be configured has to be in a unique profile so that you can run all these profiles individually? Or do we consider the possibility that two clusters are conformant if everything that should work a certain way does, with some of those being optional? And there might be a couple of other options. Those were the three that I think we came up with.
So I think we can discard this one. Anything that is an optional feature should not be part of conformance. I think if they're V1 related, I do think we should have some level of guarantees to the end users that says that this behavior has a set of tests that you can bet against, right?
And I think this is a good case law kind of thing, which is we are just now reaching the threshold that we have enough of the coverage that we can ask this important question that we kind of made some statements early on in conformance, but this would be a good time to say, by case law, if you're a V1 alpha feature, even if you're optional, we want to test you, which is a good constraint.
Yeah. Now, I think for the last two, I don't have strong opinions of A versus B, other than I think if we do actually start to create well-defined profiles, we need to do it in earnest, and think about it across not just this case, but across other ones. And that might mean modifications to the tags that exist inside of the tests to denote like some level of profile, right?
So one way we could approach this to see if it makes sense to do, whether there really are features that hang together. If we do decorate the test with some sort of feature tag, then we can do an analysis based on existing, providers, existing conformant providers. Which of those are truly very common? I mean, some sort of factor analysis essentially to say, hey, these profiles fall out in this way. There's a cloud provider one that, all the cloud providers, major cloud providers include metrics. They include load balancer services, et cetera, et cetera. Otherwise, it may be difficult really to make a decision on what those profiles should be.
So just so I understand, the expectation is that because it's a V1 API, that endpoint should exist everywhere. But the behavior of that endpoint depends upon how the cluster is configured. Is that correct?
No, the endpoint doesn't exist everywhere.
It might not be there because it's aggregated API server, so it won't be there if you haven't installed it.
Well, HPA behaves everywhere. And this is actually a good thing. Is
good point. Yeah.
Behavior doesn't change. So like there's kind of two different types. There's nuanced behavior and on-off behavior. I'm not sure they're exactly the same. Like this is not a case of nuanced behavior at the high level. It's if you have horizontal pod autoscaling and you say this and we run something with this, it correctly autoscales you. I think and I was kind of going through this in my head, which was more of a let's see what happens versus the other approach would be HPA, for instance, might behave subtly different based on refresh intervals of the underlying implementations. And I think the end user benefit, which has always been the goal for conformance, is we would fix the conformance test to take into account a reasonable range of diverging behavior, or set like a SLI type threshold. So if you set 60% CPU within 5 minutes, you'll be scaled up. Or the 5 minutes is a key part of conformance as well, which is what's the expectation someone has in the API. But yeah, the behavior here is on or off, not doesn't do the same thing everywhere.
Right, but the plan, right? The whole point of conformance is users can rely on their workloads being portable. So if there's a feature that's optional that your workload depends upon, then either you have to know, okay, my workload requires something above and beyond conformant cluster in order to work. You know, I guess
that's where profiles fits in. Like you would want a conformance profile that says it meets the criteria of these feature sets that are automatically promoted, which are on-off behaviors based upon how you're deployed, right?
And when they're on, those feature sets behave in a consistent manner across all the different Kubernetes.
Yeah, there's an interesting distinction here too of whom is the party doing the verification. We have said that we were doing this for the end user. The reality is, I think, is that the distributions and the with I'm not saying that like it's that black and white, but the vast majority of emphasis is placed by someone providing a Kubernetes distribution. And it doesn't mean that the other side, the people consuming one, isn't important, but like the guidance for profiles for those users might be different. Like if I have a workload, only I know whether I use HPA. We do not have tooling today that tells you which profiles are required to run your application across. And so like some of these aspects are good, but we're probably not going to get to them for a while. Do we focus on broadening conformance, or do we focus on closing out the end user experience?
I'm not sure I have an answer to that. Just other random thoughts. I keep trying to frame this mentally in terms of CRI versus CSI. So and correct me if I'm wrong here. Like I think of CRI as something that has a default implementation out of the box, which is Docker. But somebody can configure their cluster to use some other container runtime, and I expect the conformance tests will still pass. CSI, we currently don't have any mechanism to exercise anything that CSI does. So we don't call that conformant right now. I expect we'll probably need to go down the profile path for CSI. Or we find a default implementation of CSI that is expected to work everywhere, and we plug that in. So it's unclear to me whether this is something we just don't have an adequate default implementation for, or
it
it's
has to run separately.
optional.
People don't always run it, and with the decision of whether that's okay and they can be conformant if they're not running it.
Another, it was interesting that you brought that up, Aaron, of Docker. So like Docker isn't technically the default CRI actually, because Docker in Windows and Docker in Linux behave differently as we went through. And so we have a single conformance test that covers Windows and Linux, where CRI has completely different behavior under the covers. Because of the platform distinction, there's analogous. Is it similar to say HPA is a choice like Windows or Linux, or is it not?
Yeah, I don't know. The other question that comes up in my brain is like, was it a mistake to make this V1? Should this be something that we should have like shoved off to the extensions side of things?
That in my mind, yes, but it's too late now. I think
I'm just wondering if instead of using it as the basis for case law, it's the sort of thing where we say we made a mistake, and so we will make an exception for this. But
I don't think I agree. Like CRI. I think this is much more like CRI CSI. We have a defined API that the HPA controller uses as an input. Like the metrics API is analogous to CRI. In which case, with CRI, you just can't have not one. CSI.
Yeah, but like, if I can run a cluster without, I cannot run a cluster without a CRI. I can run a cluster without metrics, right?
You can run a cluster without CSI though.
You can also run a cluster without DNS, but we've put DNS into conformance.
Yeah, you can run a cluster without Windows. You can run a cluster without Linux, technically.
Which I think is what my ask was with the, do we just lack a default implementation? Should we say you have to run a cluster with metrics going forward? Like Kubernetes from 1.16 going forward always has metrics. We don't know exactly how it's implemented, but
If people cared that much, wouldn't have we heard about it? Like, this feels like the tail wagging the dog, which is like, you must be conformant and therefore must run metric server. Whereas I'd be like, people are fine not running metric server. Great, you just don't get HPA.
Yep.
You're fine not running Windows. You don't get Windows nodes.
But how discoverable is that? Like HPA, you can discover, well, there's no metric server running, but you just said you can't really discover that HPA is non-functional. So you've got the API there that just doesn't work.
Technically, and this is like a great feature enablement discussion, which is we've resisted an API that tells you which features are enabled. There is at least a check you can do to see if you have Windows nodes, and there is a check you can do to see if you have a metric server installed and registered. It's just not the same discovery mechanism. Is the mechanism the key part, or is it the intent?
Well, it's the intent, but if you have to know, in order for HPA to work, in order for this API to work, I have to have this other service on and another set of APIs. That's kind of less than ideal.
Yeah, and I think that aspect of it is a great example of, it is an optional feature, but you can, so the interesting thing here is HPA is optional because time varying workloads, there's plenty of other ways. Like if you have a cluster that automatically scales up and scales down applications after 24 hours, you'd still be conformant today, right? You are allowed to have a cluster where the administrator makes decisions about your application outside of your control. And so HPA, you are opting into one form of that. Conformance dictating whether, whether your app auto scales up or down. Yeah.
So I think we can enter into this full philosophical conundrum, or what's the meaning of life? And one of the things I think we might want to start doing here is, we've talked about it for a long time, but we really need to lay down the taxonomy of like, what are the demarcation lines for certain features and behaviors, and what we consider to be a profile and not a profile. And we have some of this documentation and literature sprinkled around. Like, we started many half attempts, and we even have more documentation that's in flight, I believe, that Brad had started as well, that kind of overlaps with this conversation. I think it really behooves us to write this down in a doc and to start iterating as a group on this space, because we keep on treading into it, either purposefully or by accident.
It's a real problem to solve, so we keep running into it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I am fine with that. I was just going to say, I feel like operationally, that's sort of the reason we have split meetings up the way we have, where like this is supposed to be tactically focused on what we can improve before we hit that line. And if we hit that line, we should bounce back and focus more on driving things forward.
Yeah, exactly. But one of the things we do in other SIGs is we have this set of issues that we link at the top, and they're basically long-standing issues. And if we do updates or we have thoughts on them, we just kind of go back to them. There's ones that are basically like, here are the large level feature epics that we try to track over time. Right. And I think this is one of them.
My point being, I don't know if like the broader SIG architecture meeting is the right forum, or the CNCF conformance working group meeting is the right.
That's about process around the program. I don't think that this is probably the right forum for it. This is like our sub-project working group, right? Set up some project group. So I don't.
So here's my proposal. Let's open up an issue, track it at the top of this as a long-standing epic that we need to revisit, and try to gain traction as a group and revisit it periodically, like every meeting, to see if we can start to refine this and try to take a stab at it, time permitting. In the meantime, let's still focus on the low-hanging fruit that we have plenty of, which is trying to get the increased endpoint coverage and to hold the rest of the group accountable for features that get promoted.
Good segue to PodSpec.
Yeah. Does someone want to take an action item to open up the Epic tracking for this one?
Yeah, that's fine. I can do that.
Okay. All right. So we have 4 minutes.
I'll say quickly.
I'm sorry. Do we start at half an hour mark? My brain is fried.
No, we started at 11.
Right.
12. I'll take 2 sentences on P0.0 there. So we spoke, we had that one off yesterday, and I've revised the cap partially, but I haven't finished revising it. I will get that done today or tomorrow at the latest, and then we can hopefully merge a provisional cap and start making progress.
I will be focusing on driving up the splitting, changing the tools to split things up so we can talk about behavior approval over here and test promotion over here as part of that cap.
Yes.
I look forward to rereading it. Maybe when you get it posted. Also, I think we are overdue for a bit of a backlog grooming. I propose that maybe earlier, either Thursday or Friday, perhaps having an impromptu session for those who are interested to walk through the backlog and make sure we kind of get it back in a sorted order. So by next conversation, we can have a little bit more structured outcomes.
That sounds good. I've been grooming the PRs. I've completely ignored the issues.
All right. Go ahead.
We really don't have time for it, but I used our API Snoop data to put together the list of PodSpec operations. The PodSpec properties and the kinds that use PodSpec as a property themselves, and wanted to see if we wanted to prioritize starting with one of those parameters, since all of them are optional, or any other input into how we start into this P1 work.
How about this is a great topic for grooming?
Okay, there's no tickets yet. This is just a starting point.
Okay. I have to go through issues. Does Thursday or Friday work better for other people?
Friday better for me. I'm pretty much open on Friday.
Yeah, I usually prefer Friday early where possible for impromptu stuff.
Friday early is Saturday.
Friday early is Saturday for you?
Yeah. I don't mind, but I don't want to do it every time.
I can do Thursday early or Friday early.
How are we defining early?
And I have to run anyway, so whatever you come up with, just drop in the channel.
Well, we're at time. Why don't we coordinate on the channel?
Okay.
And
All right.
let's do it that way.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care.